In a Capitol Hill showdown watched by over 3.2 million people, Jasmine Crockett didn't just confront Marco Rubio, she exposed him. What started as a routine hearing on gender policy spiraled into a national spectacle when Crockett, armed with classified files and unshakable poise, dismantled a narrative Rubio had spent years crafting. One email, one witness, one perfectly timed silence. And suddenly the Secretary of State, the man once seen as untouchable, had nothing left but 18 seconds of televised silence that echoed across the nation. This wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning. And Crockett didn't win because she spoke louder. She won because she refused to look away. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with power, it's the one who brings the truth into the light and dares you to deny it. But before that silence shattered the chamber, before the cameras rolled and the world held its breath, there was a single room, a single file, and a woman alone in the dark. It began with a silence so sharp it could slice through armor. The House Committee Chamber, normally a theater of routine policy bickering, now pulsed with a strange electricity. Rows of cherrywood benches gleamed beneath a harsh white light, and every corner of the room was swallowed in shadows, except for the witness chair, which sat bathed in unforgiving fluorescence, like a defendant on trial. Behind the marble-railed gallery, cameras clicked softly as news photographers jockeyed for position. The air was thick with the unspoken understanding that something bigger than policy was about to erupt. Security stood tense, not because of threat, but because of truth. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a powder keg waiting for its spark. Marco Rubio entered with the gait of a man who believed the storm would pass him. Clad in a dark navy suit, his lapel pin glinting under the overhead lights, he walked slowly to the witness table and sat down, flanked by aides with briefcases full of talking points and denials. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. This wasn't about charm, it was about control. He adjusted the mic in front of him like he'd done 100 times before, but the calm in his hands betrayed the flicker in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just another committee. Across the room, a name burned in silence: Jasmine Crockett. She entered quietly, almost invisibly, yet somehow turned every head in the room. A steel gray suit over a black blouse. No jewelry, no smile, just focus. She carried a folder thick with documents and receipts, literal and metaphorical. When she reached her chair, she didn't look at Rubio. She looked straight into the crowd of press behind him. Let them see her eyes. Let them record not just the facts, but the fury. Crockett had been handed the responsibility to lead the questioning today. What looked like procedural oversight on the docket, a discussion about passport markers for non-binary Americans, was, in truth, a showdown cloaked in bureaucracy. The gavel struck once, a sound so loud and definitive it startled even the cameras into stillness. "This hearing will now come to order," intoned the chair, his voice carrying the heavy rhythm of ritual. But beneath the formalities, everyone understood the stakes. Rubio's recent directive, an executive-level move to ban the issuing of passports with an X-gender designation, had triggered waves of protests, lawsuits, and outcry from human rights organizations. He had called it a return to biological reality. Jasmine Crockett had called it something else: erasure. The decision had disproportionately impacted already vulnerable communities, and for her, it was personal. The first few minutes passed in procedural monotony. Names were entered into the record. Witnesses were sworn in. But then it came. "Representative Crockett, you may begin your questioning." And with those words, the atmosphere shifted from institutional to incendiary. She stood, not slowly, not hesitantly, but like someone rising from a place deeper than politics, like someone who had carried generations in her bones and wasn't here to ask for permission to speak. The folder in her hand slapped open on the desk like a thunderclap. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The authority was in the silence between her words. "Mr. Secretary," she began, not blinking, "under what authority does a man who has never lived a life outside the binary get to decide the legitimacy of the lives who do?" Gasps didn't echo, but they vibrated beneath the breath-holding silence. Rubio shifted, not visibly but enough. He leaned toward the mic. Congresswoman, the policy aligns with national security protocols and ensures uniform data collection, but she cut in. Uniformity does not equal humanity, Mr. Secretary. Her tone wasn't anger. It was incision, every word a scalpel. Her eyes scanned the documents before her, but didn't need them. This wasn't about reading facts. It was about revealing truths long buried beneath policies dressed in neutral language and weaponized bureaucracy. Rubio leaned back, folding his hands like a man preparing for turbulence. But the turbulence was already here. Crockett continued. According to internal emails from your office dated February 3rd, made available via subpoena, this decision wasn't based on protocol. It was based on political alignment. You cited party optics and re-election dynamics when discussing the passport gender marker policy with your staff. Rubio opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. That document lacks full context, he said. Crockett didn't look up. The context is clear. You weren't targeting systems. You were targeting people. Her voice sliced through the air, steady and unrelenting. Across the room, aides whispered, reporters scribbled, and a live ticker on a news channel labeled the moment. Rubio confronted, gender passport policy under fire. Crockett leaned forward now, her voice a notch lower, colder. And let's talk about whose data we're protecting, because the very think tank that helped draft this policy, America 2100, is also under investigation for distributing disinformation campaigns targeting trans communities. Do you deny your ties to them? Rubio stiffened. I am not responsible for the messaging of independent entities. But Crockett was ready. You weren't just responsible, you were funding them. The air had grown heavy, oppressive. Rubio reached for a glass of water but didn't drink. His throat tightened. His eyes flickered toward the committee chair as if seeking refuge. None came. Jasmine Crockett's voice dropped to a near whisper, and yet it thundered. When you use the power of government to erase identity, to control truth, to silence those who don't look or live like you, you're not protecting America, Mr. Secretary. You're redefining it, and we will not let you. Silence followed, not the kind that soothes, the kind that signals reckoning. Rubio didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His face did. The room was still again. But this stillness wasn't peace. It was the eye of the storm, one that had just begun to swell. The camera zoomed in. Crockett didn't blink. She knew this wasn't just about Rubio. It was about the system that had built men like him, and the generation now rising to dismantle it. 3 days before the hearing, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her Capitol Hill office long after midnight, lit only by a single desk lamp and the soft mechanical whir of the ventilation system. Her eyes scanned every page of the manila folder that had arrived in an unmarked envelope, slipped beneath her door like a whisper of war. There was no sender's name, but the initials in the upper left corner were unmistakable. GEC, the Global Engagement Center, a federal entity under the State Department's control. Inside the folder were hundreds of documents, email chains, internal memos, and, most damning of all, a digital trail linking Marco Rubio's office to a network of far-right influencers, conspiracy theorists, and hate-fueled content creators. One name kept reappearing like a virus in the metadata: America 2100. Jasmine didn't blink as she turned the pages. Her eyes burned, not from fatigue, but fury. The folder detailed a covert operation where State Department staff had collaborated, off the record, with the think tank to produce videos targeting immigrant communities, LGBTQ+ youth, and dissenting journalists. Cloaked in public messaging initiatives, the campaign was a surgical strike against the very fabric of pluralism. Narrative alignment, one memo read, minimize friction points with conservative donors. It wasn't just unethical, it was a systemic betrayal, and it had Marco Rubio's fingerprints smeared across every corner, disguised in deniability and distance. Crockett knew exactly what she was holding. Not paperwork, ammunition. But the power she held came at a cost. No security detail would protect her from the kind of storm this folder could unleash. Going public meant facing not just Rubio's political machine, but the MAGA-aligned media empire behind it. The talk shows, the smear campaigns, the death threats wrapped in patriotism. But Jasmine Crockett had never been built for comfort. She'd been forged in courtrooms where justice wasn't blind. It was barricaded, and every step she'd taken to Congress was paid for in resistance. "They want silence," she whispered to herself. "They're about to get fire." Meanwhile, across the city, in a sleek, glass-walled office inside the State Department's executive wing, Marco Rubio reviewed a much different set of documents. Flanked by a trio of advisors and a whiteboard filled with talking points, he moved like a general preparing for a televised war. "We stick to the script. National security, data integrity, biometric consistency," he said, circling buzzwords with a red marker. He had done this dance before, when the media came after him for his luxury expenses on party credit cards, when protesters flooded his office over the Dreamers, and when reporters unearthed the foreclosure fiasco with Rivera. Every time he'd weathered the storm, every time the noise died down. He believed this would be no different, but there was something about Crockett that unsettled him, not because of her voice, but because of how she used silence. Rubio understood politics as spectacle. Crockett approached it like surgery, and the rumors his team had heard about leaked documents, internal witnesses, and a possible whistleblower from GEC left him with a nagging tension he couldn't shake. "She won't have anything concrete," he told his aides. "Even if she does, we'll discredit the source." He leaned back, confident, or pretending to be. In Marco's world, optics always beat evidence, until they didn't. Outside the public gaze, the battle lines were already drawn, not with banners but beliefs. Crockett's team worked around the clock to cross-reference the leaked files, verify timestamps, and prepare exhibits admissible for congressional record. This wasn't just about Rubio. It was about a network, one that used government resources to push a narrow worldview while silencing the margins. Jasmine had seen this before, in voter suppression laws, in ICE raids at 4 a.m., in classrooms stripped of Black history. And she knew, if she didn't expose this, no one else would. Not in time. Not before it became law. The morning before the hearing, as the Capitol lawn glistened under frost and the media vans lined Constitution Avenue, two opposing engines of strategy powered into motion. Crockett rehearsed her opening with her legal counsel, not to sound theatrical, but bulletproof. Every claim had a citation. Every question was a trap dressed as curiosity. Meanwhile, Rubio's press team coordinated with sympathetic networks to prep counter-narratives. Democrats overreaching, Crockett seeking headlines, Rubio defending American values. It was a chessboard, and both players knew the first mistake would cost more than votes. It would cost legacy. But beneath the surface, this wasn't a battle of left versus right. It was something deeper. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just fighting Rubio. She was fighting the normalization of erasure. The idea that the system could function while sacrificing the most vulnerable and calling it policy. That decisions made in boardrooms far from the communities they affect could go unchallenged. That powerful men could hide behind structure and never be forced to answer for impact. For her, the folder was not just evidence, it was testimony, from voices who would never sit at that witness table, and she would speak for them. As dusk fell the night before the hearing, Crockett stood by the Capitol steps, watching the sun bleed behind the dome. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. Across town, Rubio raised a glass of scotch in a closed-door dinner with donors, laughing at a joke none of them would repeat publicly. Neither of them knew how far the fire would spread, but both knew this wasn't about a passport. It was about the soul of a nation, one side trying to shrink it, the other determined to defend it, even if it burned them in the process. The chair nodded. "Representative Crockett, you have the floor." And in that instant, the entire chamber seemed to lean forward. Not just the members seated along the curved dais, not just the press corps whose fingertips hovered over keyboards, but the audience watching live across the country, glued to television screens, cell phones, and YouTube feeds. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, deliberately, like a blade being unsheathed. Her voice when it came was calm, too calm. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her tone the kind one might use to begin a prayer or a war. "And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. She didn't sit. She didn't blink. Before we discuss policy, I'd like to enter something into the record. She turned to her folder with the precision of a surgeon and extracted a printed email chain, 8 pages long, highlighted, time-stamped, and damning. She held it up for all to see. This, she said, is an internal email from the think tank America, 2100, dated April 12th of last year. She moved toward the clerk and handed it over. Subject line, Rubio directives, messaging alignment. Rubio shifted in his seat. Crockett continued, reading directly. We've received final approval from Secretary Rubio's office. Proceed with the framing on biological truth and tie it to migrant influx threats. Include religious justification. Target, suburban faith moms. The room froze. Every syllable hit like thunder against glass. Rubio raised his hand slightly, voice steady but thinner than it should have been. Congresswoman, if I may, that email references my office, not me directly. I don't have operational oversight over external organizations. His lips curled into a practiced smile. You understand how bureaucracy works. But Jasmine wasn't smiling. Yes, she said sharply. I understand exactly how bureaucracy works. I've seen it weaponized to sterilize injustice. I've watched powerful men hide behind assistance and language so sanitized it can't be prosecuted, but can still kill hope. She stepped closer to the mic, her voice now edged with steel. You gave the approval. That's not bureaucracy. That's authorship. Across the room, subtle glances began darting between Republican members. Furtive, uneasy. One leaned in toward another and whispered, barely audible. Rubio tried to collect himself. That email lacks proper verification, he said, tapping his folder like it was a shield. No official letterhead, no signature. Crockett didn't look away. It came from a secure server, from your deputy's email, and I have the chain, with IPS with routing data. Her hand remained on the folder. We can submit that too, if you'd like to go deeper. The confidence drained slightly from Rubio's eyes. Not panic yet, but premonition. A recognition that this wasn't going to be a manageable skirmish. This was a siege. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering in tone but rising in intensity. Let's stop pretending this is about policy. This isn't about passport designations. It's about propaganda. You funded a media narrative that painted trans youth as existential threats. You approved talking points comparing gender nonconformity to criminality. You allowed fear to be sculpted into strategy, then wrapped it in God and data. Her eyes burned through him. That's not leadership. That's cowardice with a budget. The silence was now different, not passive, not stunned. It was active, like oxygen waiting for a match. Rubio looked down, adjusted his tie, then raised his chin. I've served this country with honor. I've defended American values. Crockett didn't blink. Whose values? She snapped. Because if America is just the people who look like you, worship like you, or love according to your moral checklist, then I assure you I don't recognize that flag. One of the aides sitting behind Rubio scribbled frantically on a legal pad. Another whispered into an earpiece. Crockett stood her ground. You tried to erase identities. Now you're trying to erase responsibility. Her voice dropped again, not for lack of strength, but for control. It won't work here. Not today. The chair interrupted, voice tentative. Let's remain within the scope of the hearing. But no one was listening. The hearing had already left the scope. The people in the room weren't watching procedure. They were watching power fracture. Rubio tried to reassert himself. I respect all Americans. This line of questioning is politically motivated. Crockett smiled for the first time. Just a flicker. Yes, she said, because politics becomes a matter of survival when the people you silence die quietly. Her words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The volume was in the silence that followed. At the back of the room, a camera light blinked red. Live streams surged. Hashtags exploded. Across the country, people sat up straighter. Not because someone yelled, but because someone finally said what so many had whispered for too long. Jasmine didn't grandstand. She didn't dramatize. She prosecuted with facts, with fire, and with the kind of fury born from watching too many doors close on too many voices. And this was only her first blow. It happened with no fanfare, no raised voice, no drama in Crockett's tone. "Mr. Chairman," she said evenly, "I request permission to introduce a classified internal training video obtained via subpoena from the Global Engagement Center. It contains materials never released to the public, and it pertains directly to the matters under discussion today." The words sounded sterile, routine, but the air in the hearing room turned molten. Rubio looked up sharply. The mask he'd spent hours wearing began to shift, ever so slightly. His eyes flicked to his staff, then back to the chair. "Objection," he snapped. "That content is restricted. It was never meant for public dissemination." His voice cracked against the silence. It was the first time he didn't sound like the Secretary of State. He sounded like a man cornered. The chair, a seasoned centrist who had survived a dozen media firestorms, paused for only a moment. Then he nodded. "Given the public interest, the legal clearance provided, and the relevance to this committee, I'll allow the footage." A low murmur rumbled across the room like a warning tremor. Jasmine gave a slight nod to her aide, who tapped the keyboard of a government-issued laptop wired directly to the chamber's projector system. The lights dimmed automatically. The tension did not. The first frame blinked to life on the overhead screens. A black slate with a white label. GEC, Training Module, Strategic Content Interventions. Then the screen flickered, and hell followed. The footage opened with a simulated social media interface. A fake news headline appeared: "Migrant caravans carrying biological weapons." Then came the narration, calm and robotic. "In instances where facts cannot drive sentiment, alternative narratives must be deployed to achieve national cohesion." On screen, algorithms shifted content rankings, bearing factual reports and elevating fear-based commentary. "Priority amplification," the voice continued, "favors emotionally resonant content over verified data." Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. The video spoke in a language more devastating than accusation. It spoke in confession. Then came the cut. A camera in a low-lit conference room. 6 men, 1 woman, all in suits, seated around a projection screen. One of them, partially in shadow but unmistakable, leaned forward and pointed to a chart labeled "Psychographic Targets, Suburban, Evangelical, Minority Distrust." He spoke clearly. "We'll frame it as truth reclamation. We don't need to say it's false. We just need it louder." The symbol of the State Department hung behind him on the wall. A coffee mug with the GEC logo sat at his elbow. Marco Rubio sat at the head of the table, silent, watching, nodding once. The room exploded. Not with noise, but with energy. Reporters' hands shot to their phones. Staffers gasped audibly. A junior committee member dropped her pen. Rubio stood. "This is outrageous. That meeting was classified and stripped of context. You have no legal—" The chair cut in. "Sit down, Mr. Secretary." It was not a suggestion. "The content has been legally obtained and cleared. The American public has a right to witness what's done in their name." Rubio's jaw clenched. The broadcast caught it all. The video continued. A mocked-up campaign simulation played across the screen. Ads designed for social platforms, tagged with phrases like "protect the family," "secure the border," and "stop the agenda." The narrator continued, "Coordinate cross-platform emotional targeting. Avoid policy terms. Focus on identity triggers." One ad morphed mid-frame, turning from a stock photo of a family into an image of a protest with digitally altered fire. At the bottom, a paid-for disclosure. Sponsored by America 2100. The same think tank Crockett had tied to Rubio only hours before. The circle was complete. When the lights came back on, no one spoke. Rubio remained standing, his chest heaving like he'd run 5 miles uphill. Crockett sat still, eyes locked forward. Her voice, when it returned, was not triumphant, it was surgical. "Mr. Secretary," she said, "you didn't just authorize strategy, you sanctioned deception. You didn't protect national security. You manipulated national fear. You took public funds and used them to divide the very public you swore to serve." Every word landed with deadly precision. This wasn't about misinformation. It was about control, of narrative, of identity, of reality itself. Rubio stepped forward, hands clenched at his sides. That video doesn't show decision-making. It shows a discussion, ideas, nothing actionable. I didn't approve distribution, but he stopped. He saw the looks. Even the Republican members weren't defending him anymore. They weren't leaning forward. They were leaning away, as if his fall might catch them too. Crockett's expression didn't waver. And yet it happened. The campaigns ran, the ads launched, the narratives infected discourse, and communities paid the price. She opened her folder once more. Would you like to see the expense reports linked to the ad buys? A murmur swept the room again. Cameras caught every flinch, every frozen breath. Outside the hearing, the world had erupted. News anchors called it the leak of the decade. Hashtags multiplied. # deception by design. # Rubio resign. # Crockett courage. Protesters had already begun to gather outside the Capitol. For many, this was no longer a hearing. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett stood in the center of it, not shouting, not grandstanding, but burning everything that hid behind plausible deniability. For a full 30 seconds after the lights came back on, Marco Rubio said nothing. But his eyes were moving, calculating. Wounded men don't retreat in silence. They reload. And somewhere beneath the collapse of his public composure, a plan had been waiting like a snare beneath fallen leaves. Then, just as the room began to stabilize, Rubio reached into a thin leather binder and retrieved a document that didn't look like the rest. It wasn't a policy brief or a legal memo. It was printed in bold font, with a highlighted passage at the center. He stood, not rushed, not shaken. Controlled, dangerous. "Mr. Chairman," he said, voice smooth again, "if this committee is interested in full transparency, I have something to submit for the record." The chair hesitated, eyes flicking toward Crockett, then nodded. "Proceed." Rubio stepped forward. "This is a transcript from a community event in Dallas, dated March 2023. Congresswoman Crockett, speaking before a group of veterans, made the following statement." He raised the page and read, "This country spends more money on bombs than on books. And when you keep arming the world instead of healing your own people, you're not leading, you're spreading dysfunction." He let the paper hang in the air like a sword before it drops. "Now tell me, does that sound like someone who believes in America's strength? Or someone who sees this country as a villain in the story?" The air thinned. The temperature didn't change, but everyone suddenly felt cold. It wasn't just a deflection, it was a trap. The kind designed not to win an argument, but to smear the opponent's soul. Crockett didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened ever so slightly. Rubio pressed on. "In moments of national tension, we need unity, not slander. And I question whether someone who routinely undermines our military, our veterans, and our foreign policy commitments is truly acting in the best interests of the United States." The message was clear. He wanted to paint her as unpatriotic, disloyal, anti-American. A familiar playbook, repackaged for prime time. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't born in silence. She came from courtrooms where truth bled under cross-examination. From neighborhoods where patriotism wasn't draped in flags. It was carried in struggle. She waited until Rubio finished, then stood. The room shifted again, like the tilt of a camera right before the protagonist delivers the final blow. "Mr. Secretary," she said, her voice low but resonant, "you want to question my love for this country?" She stepped forward, closing the space between them like a slow, inevitable tide. "Then let's talk about love. I love this country enough to challenge it, enough to fight for the people you pretend to protect while feeding them fear." She paused, scanning the chamber. "If loving America means applauding every bomb it drops while our schools crumble and our hospitals go underfunded, then no, I don't love it that way. I don't worship flags while ignoring the people beneath them." Her voice hardened. "Patriotism isn't obedience, it's accountability. And if your version of love requires silence in the face of hate, then let me say it loud. I don't love that kind of America." Gasps echoed across the gallery. Some subtle, some stunned, but none indifferent. Rubio tried to interject. "That kind of rhetoric divides." She cut him off, not with volume, but with force. No, what divides this country is the lie that critique equals betrayal. You wrapped disinformation in a flag, and now you're shocked that someone lit a match. Her tone was electric, not angry, but alight with purpose. You tried to drown me in doubt, but I won't apologize for wanting better. I won't apologize for demanding that my government stop criminalizing difference and start reflecting the people it serves. The tension in the room reached critical mass. A committee member on Rubio's side looked down, pretending to review papers. Another leaned back, disengaged, unwilling to share the fallout. Crockett wasn't just defending herself, she was dragging the false narrative of blind nationalism into the light and setting it on fire. She looked directly at Rubio. You want to make this about loyalty? Fine. I'm loyal to justice, to truth, to the families watching from living rooms where opportunity never knocked. You want to call that un-American? Go ahead. But history has never been kind to the ones who confuse conformity with courage. And then silence. Heavy. Dense. Every spectator, every staffer, every camera operator knew they'd witnessed more than a rebuttal. They'd watched a reversal. A woman accused of betrayal had just redefined allegiance, and she did it without blinking. Rubio didn't respond. Couldn't. Not without looking smaller. The moment was no longer his to command. Crockett had claimed it, and with it, the moral high ground. The chair cleared his throat, almost in awe. We'll proceed, he said. But everyone knew they'd crossed a line. There was no going back. The room had not recovered from the last blow when Crockett rose again, this time with an envelope sealed in crimson wax, an archaic gesture in the digital age, but one that commanded attention. She held it aloft like a relic. Mr. Chairman, she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the heavy air, the committee has just received a sworn affidavit from a former staffer in Secretary Rubio's office. The witness requested anonymity but agreed to testify in writing under penalty of perjury. The hum of reporters' fingers on keys began again, frantic and staccato. Rubio visibly stiffened, the muscles in his neck tightening as if the noose had finally touched skin. Crockett placed the envelope on the table. With the committee's permission, I will read it aloud. Permission was granted without hesitation. The clerk broke the seal, and Crockett unfolded the letter like a bomb technician with wire cutters. Her eyes scanned the first lines, then lifted to meet the room. The witness served in the Office of Strategic Operations within the State Department from June 2023 to January 2025, she began. They write, on November 4, 2024, I received direct verbal instruction from Secretary Marco Rubio to prepare all communications between our office and America 2100 for review. She paused, letting the words settle. The term used was clean it up. When I asked for clarification, the secretary replied, wipe anything that looks too coordinated. Use the outside server if necessary. A collective gasp passed through the gallery like a gust of wind bending steel. For a moment, even the stenographer seemed to hesitate, her fingers frozen above the keys. Crockett kept going. Later that evening, I witnessed staff transferring documents from our secure drive to an unmonitored external system. These actions were not logged in our formal data records. When I questioned the legality, I was told, you didn't see it, just follow orders. Crockett's hands didn't shake, but her voice hardened with every syllable. This occurred 48 hours before a scheduled internal audit of the Global Engagement Center. Rubio leaned forward, suddenly alive with indignation. This is a fabrication, he barked. Anonymous testimony has no place in a hearing like this. It's a political smear, not evidence. But his voice, for all its volume, couldn't outrun the gravity now surrounding him. One of the committee aides whispered to the chair. The word subpoena was quietly passed between lips. Crockett turned to Rubio, the fire in her eyes now unmistakable. Do you deny that your office used an unsecured data channel to reroute communication with a third-party media contractor while under review? Rubio didn't answer. Instead, he glared at the desk, at the paper that now carried the weight of his past decisions. Crockett continued, voice like a drumline marching toward confrontation. I reported these events to my direct superior, who responded, no one's touching this. You want a future? Walk away. I resign the next week. I have not spoken publicly about these events until now. She folded the letter and placed it gently beside the microphone. Let the record show that the witness requested full whistleblower protection through the Office of Congressional Ethics. The chair nodded grimly. So ordered. Then came the phrase, spoken first in a whisper by a Democratic member on the panel, but soon echoed and recorded. Evidence tampering. Reporters launched into action. Hashtags erupted in real time. Data wipe trended within 10 minutes. News tickers on live broadcasts rolled out a chilling phrase. Crockett reads sworn testimony alleging Rubio ordered deletion of internal records. Across the country, headlines reshuffled. This was no longer a clash of ideologies. This was obstruction. It was criminal. In that instant, the hearing wasn't just a forum, it was a fuse. And Crockett had just lit the wire. Rubio tried to regain his footing. Even if these statements were true, which I categorically deny, there is no proof I gave illegal orders. Office cleanup before an audit is standard. But he knew. Everyone knew. You don't move files to outside servers for housekeeping. You don't use phrases like wipe anything unless you're afraid of being seen. And when a staffer testifies under oath that the Secretary of State feared transparency more than truth, it's not just optics, it's a collapse. Crockett stared him down with unblinking clarity. You didn't just cross a line, you tried to bury it, and now the American people are watching you dig. Her voice was thunder wrapped in restraint. You spent years building walls of plausible deniability, layers of assistance, memos, third-party contractors, but shadows have voices, and they're speaking. The room was dead quiet, not because it was stunned, but because it was listening, for the first time in years, to a truth that didn't need a gavel to be real. The chair's gavel struck once, clean, ceremonial, final. Secretary Rubio, he said, eyes narrowed but voice neutral. You may offer closing remarks at this time. The invitation hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Every lens in the room swung toward Rubio. Every microphone turned. Every heartbeat seemed to slow. He didn't move at first. Then he shifted in his seat, barely, adjusted the cuffs on his shirt, and placed both hands on the table before him. The lights above burned down like truth itself. For the first time all day, Marco Rubio looked smaller than his title. The air in the chamber thinned. The world waited. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. His throat bobbed once. No sound followed. The silence was not empty. It was deafening. Not hesitation, but implosion. In that moment, Rubio's years of polish, of practiced rebuttals and media-trained reflexes, failed him. The armor cracked. The cameras caught it all. His eyes darted, first toward the Republican members who avoided his gaze, then toward his aides who had gone pale and still. Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply turned in her chair to face him fully, folding her hands in front of her, and looked at him. Unmoving, unblinking, undeniable. The seconds crawled. 4, 7, 11. The silence turned molten. On-screen countdowns began appearing on social feeds. Lev, Rubio's 18 seconds of silence. You could hear the clicking of cameras, the quiet thump of a reporter's pen hitting the floor, the faint hum of static in the speakers. Still, Rubio said nothing. It was no longer a pause. It was a confession, not in words, but in surrender. The kind of silence that only follows the realization that there are no more lies left to use, no more shadows to retreat into. Crockett's gaze didn't break. If anything, it sharpened. She was no longer prosecuting. She was witnessing the unraveling. Behind her, aides began passing notes, updates from social media. The Rubio pause was trending in 15 countries. Major outlets went live with side-by-side comparisons. Crockett's expression, calm, strong, still, versus Rubio's unraveling composure. Some called it poetic justice. Others called it the fall of a man who had once been untouchable. But inside the room, no one spoke, because everyone understood what they had just seen. Not an accident, not a gaffe, a reckoning. Power that had always spoken with confidence was now suffocating in its own silence. At second 18, Rubio finally cleared his throat and leaned into the mic. His voice was barely above a whisper. I have no further comment. He didn't elaborate, didn't defend, didn't fight. He just folded. It was over, not by declaration, but by exposure. The spell of untouchability had broken. He gathered his papers slowly, mechanically, hands slightly trembling. No one applauded, no one interrupted. This wasn't victory, it was aftermath. Crockett remained silent, still watching, still present. Her strength was in stillness, and it said more than any closing statement ever could. Outside the Capitol, the world erupted. Protesters roared, reporters swarmed, screens flashed quotes and replays on loop. But inside the chamber, Jasmine Crockett simply leaned back in her chair. She didn't need to spike the moment. She had already done what needed to be done. She had stared power in the face, stripped of its costume, and made the country watch, not with fire, with truth. And in the silence that followed, a generation heard her louder than ever before. By dawn, Washington had become an echo chamber of disbelief. Every major newspaper ran front-page spreads with bold accusatory headlines. Rubio wiped records? One lawmaker calls it soft treason. The 18 seconds that shook Capitol Hill. Crockett dismantles the Secretary of Silence. The New York Times called it the most stunning public implosion of a cabinet official since Watergate. CNN broke into programming with a special ticker. Rubio under fire, congressional inquiry imminent. And Fox News, once deferential to the secretary, switched tone overnight. Was Rubio lying all along? The press smelled blood, and the sharks had come in full. Within 48 hours, a bipartisan group of House and Senate leaders announced the formation of a temporary investigative committee with subpoena power, focused on data manipulation, whistleblower suppression, and possible obstruction of justice linked to the Global Engagement Center. The Justice Department, blindsided by the ferocity of the fallout, confirmed a parallel inquiry. Rumors swirled that FBI forensic teams were already combing through off-site servers tied to America 2100. And in an emergency press briefing held behind closed doors, Marco Rubio announced he would be temporarily delegating select duties as Secretary of State to his deputy. He didn't use the word step back, but everyone knew what it meant. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered in waves. Young, old, veterans, students, LGBTQ+ activists, mothers with children on their hips. They carried signs that said, "Silence is complicity," and Crockett didn't pause. One banner stretched across a block read, "Truth doesn't need clearance." Chants filled the air like wildfire. 18 seconds too late. Investigate. We heard the silence. It wasn't just a movement, it was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had become its unlikely face. Not because she sought the spotlight, but because she had stood still when the whole system tried to make her disappear. Crockett's schedule transformed overnight. Invitations flooded her inbox from The Late Show, Morning Joe, The Readout, 60 Minutes. Pundits wanted her on record. Audiences wanted to hear her voice. But when she finally appeared on national television, poised in a gray suit, eyes tired but unbowed, she didn't speak like a victor. "I didn't come to win," she told one interviewer. "I came to stop the erasure. What we do now, that's what matters. This can't end with headlines." Her words rippled across the country, reaching places Congress rarely did. Classrooms, kitchen tables, barbershops, hospital break rooms. She wasn't performing. She was reminding the country who it had forgotten. But the backlash, too, came swift and ugly. Rubio's loyalists unleashed coordinated media attacks, clips taken out of context, personal smears, veiled threats on fringe networks. Bots flooded Crockett's social media with messages calling her anti-American, divisive, dangerous. Her team received security warnings. She began traveling with protection. Still, she kept showing up. At forums, at vigils, at town halls packed with people who'd never watched C-SPAN, but now quoted her lines from memory. Every appearance deepened the divide, and also built the bridge. Because for every insult hurled, 10 voices rose to say, "She spoke for me." In Congress, the walls trembled. Several high-ranking Republicans privately distanced themselves from Rubio, urging him not to attend key intelligence briefings. One aide leaked that even allies found his silence indefensible. Whispers emerged that he had violated the State Department's own internal ethics protocols. There was talk, quiet but persistent, that the president had begun reviewing successors. Rubio's face, once a symbol of party discipline and ambition, had become a cautionary tale. A reminder that in the age of receipts, plausible deniability was no longer protection. It was provocation. Meanwhile, Crockett returned to her office like a soldier who had survived fire. She didn't celebrate. She didn't hold press conferences with balloons. She worked, reviewed whistleblower protection drafts, met with staff from the Office of Ethics, and late at night, after the building emptied, she stared at the stack of unopened letters on her desk. Most handwritten, most from strangers. One read, "My daughter saw your hearing and said, 'She fights like I want to.' Another, 'Thank you for making me feel seen, even if it's just for a day.'" She didn't cry, not then, but she folded each letter, placed them in a wooden box, and wrote one line on the lid. "Not for me, for them." The heavy oak doors of the Capitol creaked open slowly, sunlight slicing across the marble steps like a final curtain call. Jasmine Crockett emerged alone. No entourage, no media scrum. Just her, framed by the vast sky and the quiet gravity of everything that had come before. She didn't walk like someone who had won. She walked like someone who had endured. Her heels struck the steps with a rhythmic steadiness, the kind that says, "I'm not finished." The rotunda behind her was still humming with post-hearing noise. Committee aides debating language, journalists chasing after statements. But outside, the world felt slower, more deliberate. Each step she took felt like a chapter closing beneath her. A small crowd had formed at the bottom of the Capitol Hill gate. Not the angry mobs of recent years, not lobbyists or cameras. Just a cluster of students, maybe 6 or 7, no older than 20. They weren't shouting. They weren't waving flags. They were waiting. One of them, a young black woman in a denim jacket with frayed sleeves, held up a sign, trembling slightly in the wind. It was handwritten in thick blue ink, and it didn't demand a vote or declare a party. It simply read, "We don't need perfect. We need honest." Crockett stopped mid-step. Her breath caught, not from exhaustion, but recognition. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to exhale. The crowd didn't cheer. They just looked at her the way people look at someone who said the thing everyone was afraid to say. The girl holding the sign lowered it slightly, her eyes locking with Crockett's. In them was something deeper than admiration. It was trust. Crockett gave a single nod. Not grand, not performative, just a quiet affirmation, like passing a torch without needing fire. The students didn't move. They didn't need to. The moment wasn't for spectacle. It was for history. Crockett turned slightly, facing the Capitol one last time before stepping down onto the street. She knew what came next. More interviews, more hearings, more battles against polished lies and procedural evasion. The machine would grind forward. But something had shifted. She felt it. Not in headlines or hashtags, but in how people were looking at truth differently now. Like it could be reclaimed. Like it didn't need to shout to be heard. Like it didn't have to come from someone powerful, only someone brave. Behind her, the dome stood tall, gleaming like marble armor beneath the sky. But Jasmine Crockett no longer needed its shadow. Her power didn't come from its height. It came from her refusal to shrink, her refusal to fold. She kept walking, slow and deliberate, until the Capitol faded behind her. The girl with the sign whispered something to the others, and they followed Crockett at a respectful distance. Not to take a photo, not to ask for anything, but simply to walk the same path. Because when someone makes a crack in the wall, the next generation doesn't need to start with a hammer. As the scene faded, a line appeared on the screen, white letters over black. "Truth can be hidden, but it is never buried forever." Then silence, and the world kept watching. This is not just a story about politics, not just about a hearing or a scandal or a pause that unraveled a career. This is about the cost of courage in a world that demands quiet. Jasmine Crockett didn't enter that room as a savior. She entered as a woman burdened with proof, carrying voices that had been dismissed, erased, rewritten by men in polished suits behind unmarked doors. And when she stood alone, file in hand, with the weight of truth pressing against her ribs, she wasn't the most powerful person in that room. She was simply the most unwilling to flinch. That is what changed everything. In every system built on hierarchy, there comes a moment when those at the bottom are told to accept what they're given, told that leadership knows best, that questions are dangerous, that speaking too soon or too loudly might be seen as weakness or rebellion. Crockett shattered that illusion, not with noise, but with silence that dared power to explain itself. She turned a hearing into a reckoning. But make no mistake, the system did not give her that platform. It did not welcome her voice. It did not applaud her fire. It merely failed to extinguish her. And that is what makes this story matter. Because in the weeks leading up to the hearing, while Rubio's team sharpened strategies and rehearsed denials, Crockett faced a very different battle. Her own party questioned whether she was too bold, too direct, too visible. She received warnings cloaked as advice. Be careful, Jasmine. These men know how to bury people quietly. And still she moved forward. Because the folder in her hand wasn't just evidence. It was the lived experience of every voice that had been silenced in the name of order. Every queer youth labeled a threat. Every whistleblower forced into exile. Every truth deemed too disruptive for comfortable governance. This is the lesson the world must learn. Truth does not come wrapped in comfort. It rarely enters softly. It enters like Crockett, exhausted, alone, armed with nothing but facts and the fierce belief that silence is no longer an option. It is easy to admire her now, after the hashtags, after the headlines. But what must be remembered is what she risked before the first word was spoken: reputation, career, safety. And still she stood, not because she was certain of victory, but because she knew what defeat would look like if no one tried. She didn't fight for the win. She fought to make the silence break. When we ask ourselves what courage looks like, we often search for grand gestures, marches, speeches, revolutions. But sometimes courage is a folder. Sometimes it's a voice refusing to modulate in a room full of trembling titles. Sometimes it's a stare across a marble chamber, daring someone to lie under oath when the world is finally watching. And that kind of courage doesn't come from power. It comes from pain. It comes from remembering what it feels like to be unheard. It comes from living through injustice so many times that it becomes unbearable to let one more lie slide by unchallenged. Let us not forget how this story unfolded. Rubio had every tool on his side: authority, access, advisors, airtime. Crockett had only what was true. And in the end, that was enough, not because the system bent in her favor, but because she refused to bend with it. That is the true tragedy of injustice. Not just that it silences the many, but that it rewards the few who can remain silent longest. Crockett rewrote that equation. She reminded a generation that the cost of being heard is real, but so is the cost of silence. And when the powerful fall quiet, even for 18 seconds, it becomes the loudest thing in the world. Across the nation, that silence changed people. Teachers paused their lessons to stream the hearing. Families watched from dinner tables, eyes fixed on C-SPAN instead of sitcoms. Survivors of institutional cover-ups sent letters, saying they finally felt seen. Not because Crockett claimed to represent them, but because she chose to carry the fire they had been forced to smother. This wasn't about Democrats or Republicans. It was about the moment someone finally said, "I see you, and I won't let them erase you." But perhaps the most painful truth this story leaves us with is this: justice doesn't arrive when it's deserved. It arrives when someone refuses to stop dragging it forward. Crockett did not slay a dragon. She forced it into the light and made the world see the soot on its gold. She did not end corruption. She simply made it costlier. She did not win the war. She changed the map. And sometimes that is all history needs to begin again. So what do we take from this? That perfection is not the prerequisite for truth. That honesty can be rough, worn, imperfect. But when wielded with conviction, it becomes sharper than any rehearsed defense. that sometimes the most radical act is not to speak louder, but to refuse to look away. Jasmine Crockett did not perform for cameras. She prosecuted for the unheard. And when Rubio fell silent, it was not the end of a scandal. It was the beginning of a new standard. If this story moved you, ask yourself why. Was it the drama, the takedown, or was it the recognition, the flicker of familiarity in Crockett's voice? Maybe you've been in a room like that. Maybe you've been told to stay quiet, to choose your battles, to wait for the right time. But let this be a reminder. The right time is rarely handed to you. Sometimes you have to carve it out with your voice. And sometimes you have to stand so still that power trips over its own lies trying to reach you. Every story told in this film was built upon public record, dramatized for emotional and artistic resonance. Names, events, and timelines may have been adapted to protect identities and enhance the clarity of truth being pursued. But the heart of this story, the courage to stand alone in a room built to silence you, is very real. And in the end, if you take nothing else from this, take this. Truth can be silenced, hidden, manipulated, but it cannot be buried forever, because somewhere, someone will carry it back to the surface. And if no one does, be the one who does. This isn't just a story to admire. It's a call to witness, a call to remember that every silence we allow is a page we let someone else write for us. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand up because it was easy. She stood because no one else would. She stepped into that chamber armed not with status or protection, but with truth. And truth, when it finally breathes, demands more than applause. It demands action. She faced power systems designed to exhaust and erase, knowing full well what it would cost her. And if she can carry that weight into the fire, then we can carry it forward outside the screen. Because the real story begins when someone hears injustice and chooses not to scroll past. So if this moment hits you, if you felt that surge of anger, of hope, of clarity, then do not let it fade in the next click. Join us. Be part of the conversation. Subscribe to this channel not just to support the storyteller, but to keep stories like these alive in the places that try to bury them. Share this video if you believe silence should never have more airtime than truth. Leave a comment if you've ever stood alone in a room and dared to speak. And above all, stay here. Stay informed. Stay loud. Because platforms don't change the world. People do. And people like you, watching, reading, remembering, are what turn a moment into a movement. No matter how polished the lie, no matter how powerful the person behind it, truth always finds its way through the cracks. But only if we keep watching, only if we keep showing up. So if this story meant something to you, let it mean something to someone else. Subscribe, share, stand, and never ever underestimate the power of one voice, especially when the world tries to shut it down. Because when the silence ends, that's when history begins. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.